Russian general appointed by Vladimir Putin found that NATO, the Russian general who was in charge of planning the new shipment of military and ammunition to be sent from Crimea to the borders of Ukraine, was assassinated by pro-Ukrainian insurgents operating within the borders of Russia. According to the Russian intelligence service, a team of 8 people raided the Russian general's house and neutralized him with automatic weapons. Interesting news continues to come from the Bakhmut region, where the war is intense. After the Russian army managed to occupy the city of Solder, they set Bakhmut as their next target. Bakhmut, a city rich in underground resources, is a very important region for Vladimir Putin. However, there is a very different reason behind Putin's desire for the city. If the city of Bakhmut, known as the heart of the Donetsk region, is captured, this city will be used as a coordination center of the Russian army, and a large command center will be established for the Russian army. However, the Russian army, which has failed to capture the city of Bakhmut for months, has begun to wear out Vladimir Putin's patience. Putin, who now wants to capture Bakhmut, decided to send a high-ranking official serving in the Russian armed forces to the Crimean territory. However, the Kremlin stated that they decided to keep the general's identity secret for his safety. The Ukrainian government took action to find out who this general was and for what purpose he was sent. As a result of the intensive work of Ukrainian and US intelligence, it was learned that Vladimir Putin would carry out one of the largest military shipments ever organized by Vladimir Putin, and that Putin wanted a senior military official to be in charge of the shipment. This general assigned by Vladimir Putin was Dmitry Lisiecki, whose name we often hear in Russia. However, the Russian general assigned by Putin was found dead in his home before he could realize the shipment. Here are the details of the news. The Russian army, which has not been able to capture the city of Bakhmut for months, continues to suffer much greater losses every day. Putin, who has lost more than 1,400 soldiers in the attack of the Russian army on the city of Bakhmut in the past months, has run out of patience. Vladimir Putin took action after Ukrainian officials announced that the Russian army was losing more than 500 soldiers every day on the Bakhmut front. The majority of the troops, which Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, said they were kept in readiness with the decision of partial mobilization, started to be sent to Crimea via the Kerch Bridge. According to estimates, the number of these soldiers is thought to be over 20,000. This military deployment was led by Dmitry Lisiecki, who was personally appointed by Vladimir Putin. The shipment was to be sent in 2 different ways. The first shipment was to send Russian soldiers, while the second shipment was to send Russian ammunition and equipment. Dmitry Lisiecki successfully sent both of these shipments to Crimea. Now, all he had to do was to go to Crimea, establish control there, and successfully deliver these shipments to Ukrainian territory. After the first shipment, the Russian general went to his home in Stavropol to spend the night of. Our Russian officials were unaware that Ukrainian intelligence was aware of the shipment. Ukrainian intelligence officers wanted to neutralize Russian General Dmitry Lisiecki, but he had not yet left Russian borders. Ukrainian intelligence officers then contacted pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations operating within Russia's borders and demanded that the Russian general be neutralized. Ukraine, which located the Russian general's house with the support of the United States, informed the Ukrainian resistance organizations about the location of the Russian general, Dmitry Lisiecki. Thereupon, the leader of the Ukrainian resistance organization made a large-scale plan to neutralize the Russian general. All the footage of the moment of the assassination organized by the Ukrainian resistance was recorded by street cameras. However, the Russian government quickly imposed a broadcast ban on this footage. The resistance leader organized a team of 8 specially trained soldiers. This team mobilized late at night and surrounded the house where the Russian general was staying. After the lights of the house were turned off, the resistance soldiers started moving towards the house, broke the door and entered the house within seconds. the insurgents stood inside the house for only 2 minutes and neutralized the Russian general, Dmitry Lisiecki, in his own room with automatic weapons. The insurgent soldiers were assassinated within 3 minutes and left the area in a black van, never to be heard from again. When the gunshots were heard, locals alerted the security forces, but it was too late. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu deployed Russian Special Forces troops to the region to find out who carried out the assassination. After days of fighting, the Russian government decided to close the case to cover up the assassination of the general. The Russian government, which did not reveal who organized the assassination, fell into a great silence. However, days later, a statement came from the pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations that organized the assassination. In their statement made on their social media accounts, they stated that one of the senior ranks of the Russian armed forces was neutralized by the pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations last week. This statement became the agenda of the whole Russia in a very short time. Russian people took to the streets to protest against Vladimir Putin, claiming that he was unable to ensure Russia's security. However, this assassination brought much bigger problems. The soldiers and ammunition that Russian leader Vladimir Putin has sent to Crimea under the leadership of Dmitry Lisiecki were still in Crimea. These troops and equipment had to be sent to the Russian troops in Ukraine as soon as possible. However, after the assassination, Vladimir Putin assumed that the Ukrainian government knew about the shipment and decided to postpone it. Thus, the Russian army's plan to invade the city of Bakhmut was also postponed. The fact that a high-ranking soldier in the Russian armed forces was so easily neutralized has caused great panic in the Kremlin. The ease with which pro-Ukrainian insurgents have been able to move within Russia's borders has greatly shaken confidence in Vladimir Putin. Russian opposition officials blamed Vladimir Putin for the killing of General Dmitry Lisiecki. As is well known, Vladimir Putin has forcibly brought most of the Ukrainian citizens from the occupied regions of Ukraine into Russia and forced them to live in Russia. Putin, who has sent officials to the occupied territories, continues to force Ukrainian citizens to live in Russia by issuing them Russian passports. Putin's opponents brought the situation to the agenda in his parliamentary speech and started to express that Putin is getting old and making wrong decisions and that the Putin regime must come to an end. Alexei Navalny, one of the biggest Putin opponents whose name we often hear in Russia, made some statements from the prison where he is in. Alexei Navalny, whom Vladimir Putin sees as a threat to him, was seen as the only candidate against Putin. However, Putin managed to eliminate Navalny now. In a statement from prison, Navalny said that the Russian people should not allow Vladimir Putin to turn a blind eye to these wrong policies, that Putin's dictatorial regime must come to an end, and that the Russian people are the only ones who can do this, and asked the Russian people to take to the streets. The recent protests taking place within Russia's borders have been a source of great frustration for Vladimir Putin. Ukraine has started to target the biggest financial sources of the Russian army and has started to target important regions such as natural gas and oil facilities within Russia's borders. Putin, who constantly threatens Western countries with cutting off natural gas, has stopped natural gas pipelines to Germany several times. However, natural gas exports were needed to finance the Russian military. When the natural gas weapon in Vladimir Putin's arsenal no longer worked, he could no longer find a threat to lift the sanctions and embargoes on Russia. A lot of important changes happened in the Bogota area. Here, the Russians have been tightly holding on to the settlement that allowed them to assault Volodar with ease. But the latest report suggests that the Russians have finally lost control over it and are rapidly trying to adjust to the conditions by shifting their focus completely to another direction. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians slowly broke the momentum of the Russian advance by firing at Russian positions in the two hamlets from tanks, mortars, and artillery. As a result, the Ukrainians successfully pushed the Russians from their southern positions and conducted a counterattack on the eastern positions, re-establishing control over half of the hamlet. Positional fights immobilized the Russians even more, and as in this case, time works against the Russians. They tried to restore control over the eastern hamlet by any means. The loss of this area would mean that the Russians would basically need to start their operation from scratch. The Ukrainians understand this, too, which is why they have been reinforcing this group and increasing the intensity of their counterattacks. Yesterday, the Ukrainians made a final heavy counterattack and pushed the Russians away from this hamlet. Interestingly, Russian sources started circulating footage of Ukrainian prisoners of war that they allegedly took the same day in the same region, by initiating a breakthrough with their tanks. However, a lot of sources indicate that this video was recorded when the Russians just entered it 5 days ago. Russian sources also decreased their coverage of this region over the last 2 days and did not elaborate on any breakthrough and its favorable implications. Instead, the report suggests that the fights are largely positional. Importantly, one of the freshest reports noted that the only viable direction for the Russians is the southern, not eastern, which supports the conclusion that the Ukrainians have successfully pushed the Russians away. And when it comes to the southern part of Boulder, the Russians are reportedly prioritizing. It is indeed less protected than the eastern part due to the structure of the town. Ukrainian defense in the southern and western parts of the town is inherently weaker. Ukrainian sources suggest that the Russians switched to shelling this town, and because using regular artillery was not even nearly enough to support the on-the-ground operation, the Russians were also engaged in thermobaric artillery and even aviation. In fact, over the last 5 days, Russian losses in aircraft skyrocketed and reached 6 fighter jets and 7 helicopters. In comparison, before the Russians assaulted Volodar, it took the Ukrainians 4 weeks to shut down the same number of helicopters and more than 6 weeks to shut down the same number of fighter jets. And even though the numbers are concerning the whole front, Russian losses in aviation only skyrocketed from the day the Russians started storming Volodar. The Russians have also opened 2 more lines of attack, one from the farms towards the industrial area and one towards Perkisinka. Such actions further emphasize that the Russians are shifting their focus to the southern and western parts of the town, supporting the evaluation that the Russians were pushed away from the eastern positions. The attack on Perkisinka is also likely an attempt to stretch Ukrainian forces and make them allocate troops to the regions other than Volodar. Overall, a sudden attack on Volodar with the goal of swiftly establishing control over the town failed, and the Russians once again switched to positional fighting and heavy reliance on artillery and aviation. A Ukrainian military officer and coordinator recently stated that the situation has stabilized and that Russian forces failed to outflank Ukrainian forces and take control over the surrounding roads. The critical war between Ukraine and Russia almost divided Donbass into 2 fronts. The Luhansk region on the one side and the Donetsk region on the other are seen as the last exit points for Russian and Ukrainian soldiers on the front line on their way home. But for a group of Russian troops of the Second Cause of the Russian Federation in Luhansk, this door was completely closed. There is a serious panic in the city, and the Russians in the region are forcing Russia's doors on the Ukraine-Russia border. Without wasting any time, we will discover together all the details of this surprise situation. Putin's recognition of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic marked a turning point in the months-long escalation before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, this decision of Putin still determines the direction of the course of the war and clashes. In addition, the Ukrainian war continues to progress largely as a trench war. Tanks, which are indispensable in land battles, come to the fore in these regions as well. A full trench and a tank war is going on in this region. Clashes and offensive operations, on the other hand, affect the Russians in Donbass in a very negative way. The Russian troops, which have begun to feel this effect deeply in recent days, are losing heavy casualties, especially in the Luhansk region. At least four Russian infantry soldiers were eliminated last day thanks to the coordinated efforts of the aerial reconnaissance and mortar unit of the Luhansk detachment of the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service. UAV operators in the Ukrainian army, on the other hand, uncovered a Russian infantry cluster. After that, Russian troops settled in a farmhouse in the Luhansk region. The mortar team of the Ukrainian Border Guard launched a fire attack on this very area. The mortar attack carried out gave positive results. The Russian infantry group, unable to escape the artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, was blown up and destroyed. In addition, at least one Russian truck was destroyed as a result of artillery attacks. It was learned that the soldiers who could not escape the Ukrainian artillery fire in the Luhansk region belonged to the Luhansk 2nd Army cause. Another critical issue is that the losses in Luhansk reached very serious figures in Novopskov in the Luhansk region. The Russians began to build a crematorium due to the impossibility of getting their soldiers out of the clash's trenches. Luhansk Regional Governor Serhiy Haidai emphasized this in a post he shared on Telegram. On this subject, Serhiy Haidai said that information that the Russians started digging a pit near Novopskov have been discussed for a long time. Of course, this is not for the construction of a hospital, school or kindergarten. This was originally for the construction of a new crematorium because they have no place to put all these losses. According to Haidai, the Russian command has an interesting tactic. New units of newly mobilized soldiers, regular units or Kadyrovites were isolated from each other, stopping any communication between the newly arrived soldiers. In addition, Russian troops conduct reconnaissance through warfare. As a result of these constant attacks, there are many dead and wounded. Russian commanders are trying to prevent panic among the fighters by isolating the units from each other. On the other hand, while the casualties of the Russian troops in Luhansk are increasing day by day, there is an atmosphere of panic in the city. The heavy losses suffered by the 1st and 2nd Russian Army Corps deployed in the occupied region of the Ukrainian Donbass arouse complete indignation among the relatives of the soldiers in these Russian corps. The families and relatives of these soldiers in these two Russian corps continued their escape preparations by selling their immovable property and their other valuables. In addition, relatives of other Russian soldiers in Donbass were also involved in these escape plans. In Donetsk, with a population of 1 million, currently 300,000 Russians, and in Luhansk, with a population of more than 500,000, 200,000 Russian citizens are preparing to leave the Donbass region completely. So in total, 500,000 Russians took action to return to their own country. Some of the Russian citizens who wanted to escape from Donbass had been staying in this region for a long time. However, due to the situation getting out of control in the region, these Russian citizens joined the families and relatives of the Russian soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian cause to leave the place where they had lived for a long time. Currently, for about a week, all the train stations that the Russians control in Donbass are flooded with people. Russians who want to leave this region generally prefer the train route, but there are also Russian citizens trying to escape from Donbass by land. It shows that the situation on the front lines of Donbass has seriously affected the soldiers of the Russian army. The reason for this is that most of the fleeing Russian citizens are families or relatives of soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian army. Cause we will understand that the offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian forces in the last few weeks have deeply affected the Russians in the Donbass region. So what are the features of the Luhansk 2nd cause? Let's examine this cause together in detail. The transformation of the so-called Novorossiya militia units into a viable military force modeled after the Russian army began after the end of active hostilities in 2015. This process aimed to create a homogeneous semi-military structure. Republican factions could not unite due to internal clashes and differences in domains. Thus, the military strength of this group was divided into two corps. As a result, two different military forces emerged: the 1st Russian cause in the Donetsk People's Republic and the 2nd Russian cause in the Luhansk People's Republic. The transition to trench warfare made it possible to eventually transform dozens of real and virtual battalions and groups into brigades and regiments of the 1st and 2nd Cause and equip them for combat. Brigades were also deployed to Russian standards with a dual command structure to ensure their subordination in the Russian army. The dual command structure is supported by Russian inspectors who replicate all command positions at the brigade and battalion levels. By design, those who formally command these brigades are actual commanders rather than locals. But while these official commanders were actively touted in separatist and Russian media to bolster narratives of the civil war and locals taking up arms to defend their lands, de facto operational control remained firmly in the hands of the Russians. Now, due to the escalation of the Ukrainian war, the LPR's 2nd Army Corps has become part of the Russian armed forces. Russia's TASS news agency reported that the 1st Donetsk and 2nd Guards, Luhansk-Severodonetsk Corps, were included in the Russian armed forces. Referring to the Ministry of Defense, reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin presented these military formations with war colors. The ceremony took place on December 31, 2022, at the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, with a successful offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian troops also took serious blows on other Ukrainian front lines, including Luhansk. As a result of these heavy blows, the casualties exceeded thousands, and the brutal winds of the war also greatly affected the civilian citizens. Escapes in the Luhansk region are, for now, the beginning of the end. In the summer, when the mud on the front lines is completely dry, the Ukrainian armed forces will press the button to accelerate their offensive operations. As a result of these counterattacks, life will become more difficult, with the Russian troops on the front lines and the Russian civilians living there. Russian civilians who cannot stand the heat of war will find the solution by making escape plans. The Russian soldiers remaining on the front line will wait for the cold face of death to come, accompanied by an infernal landscape.